become a mafia boss at 26, continuously run his family for over 30 years, never once in that time without going to jail, and lived to be almost 100. That's all Bonanno, a man quite popular in the States but completely unknown here. Meanwhile, Bonanno was one of the most prominent figures in the American Mafia at the dawn of his reign, and his influence in the commission was higher than that of a well-known Al Capone and Luciano. Joe was the epitome of a true mafia: minimum publicity, maximum power. So, if you're interested in hearing the story of the youngest boss of the American Mafia, then meet Joseph Bonanno on the other side of the law. Today, I would like to remind you about the turn-based collectible RPG and fantasy setting Raid Shadow Legends, which we recently talked about. If you haven't had a chance to pick up those cool bonuses, hurry up! We're talking about an epic champion knight errant from the Bannerlords faction and other goodies in the form of energy refills, a skill book, and an experience booster. And once you've moved into the world of Raid and figured out what it's like, look for me under the nickname Gang1210. And if you're fast enough, you can join my clan. You can play Raid Shadow Legends on both your mobile phone and computer. So click on the link in the description and let's meet on the battlefield. The surname Bonanno, as you might think, has nothing to do with bananas. The literal translation from Italian means good year, a more adapted understanding of good time. And at the beginning of the last century, in the Castellammarese region of Sicily, the surname also meant belonging to one of the key borgata of local men of honor. Both Joseph's grandfather and father were in the Mafia, moreover, headed their clans, so Peppino, as Joe will still be called, was born in a kind of analog of a noble family, giving him certain advantages in this secret society. However, he would realize this only years later, but as a child, Giuseppe, as he was called at birth, considered his family ordinary. They were richer than most of the other inhabitants, but he had no idea of his father's true power. Nor did he know why they'd moved to New York City in 1908 when he was barely 3 years old, and why they had to return a few more years later. And it was precisely because of Salvatore Bonanno's position. He was the head of the clan and led it in a war against another mafia family, Castellammare Buccellato. He had to flee to the States to avoid going to jail, and as soon as the case was closed, Salvatore immediately returned home to lead the family. Joe, on the other hand, was not involved in any of these squabbles. He was an ordinary, carefree child. However, in 1915, his father died of injuries sustained on the fields of the First World War, and 5 years later his mother died, and Bonanno Jr. had to grow up very quickly. His guardianship was taken over by his uncle, Stefano Magaddino. Not to be confused with the Buffalo boss of the same name, they are different people. At the relatives, Joe will live until his adulthood, and then move to Palermo, entering the Maritime Academy there. Thanks to the prosperity of his parents, he did not have to work. The estate, which came under the management of his uncle, brought enough that Bonanno could devote all of his time to training, which he really liked. He dreamed of becoming a captain and sailing his ship to far and near. However, even here, he faced difficulties and disappointments. It was 1924, the third year of training. The cherished diploma was already looming before his eyes, but everything was spoiled by the Italian fascists who took power in the country into their own hands. No, the repression of the people of honor has nothing to do with it. In full measure, they will begin afterwards. And Bonanno himself could not worry about it then. He was a cadet, not a mafioso. The obstacle that stood between him and the final exam was a black tunic. Literally. The fascists had lowered an order that students at Palermo Naval Academy must change their tunics from white to black. Bonanno, already disliking fascist rhetoric, refused to obey this and whipped up the rest of the course to do so. Gradually, of course, the protest among the students began to diminish, and they began to be threatened with expulsion, and black replaced white. And 7 of the cadets who never gave up their principles were suspended for 3 months, giving them time to think and return in clothes whose palette would better suit the mood of the country. Bonanno was among them, and he wasn't going to think about anything. Hot Sicilian blood, mixed with youthful maximalism and pride inherited from his father, did not give any chance to return to a place where he was forced to impose someone else's will. Joseph was now not destined to realize his childhood dream of becoming a ship captain. However, no one forbade him to find a new one, and he decided to do it outside of Sicily. The first stop was Tunisia, where he stayed with his uncle for a couple of months, while he waited for his cousin Peter Magaddino, with whom they decided to leave Sicily. And as soon as Pete got there, they immediately went to France. In Paris, they were met by another cousin, the son of an uncle from Tunisia named Salvatore. However, Paris was not the final stop either. Joe himself did not remember America well, but his father, while he was still alive, had told him many times that it was a land of great opportunity. And as soon as one dream was taken away from Bonanno, he immediately found another, to cross the ocean, as they would say nowadays, to rise in the United States. It was for the purpose of going to America that they came to Paris. The plan was to get visas here and leave on the first steamer. But they couldn't get visas. As it turned out, they couldn't get them without a passport, which Pete didn't have. No one was going back to Sicily. Instead, the brothers went to Cuba, where they found people who took them by boat to Tampa. In the States, the newly minted illegal aliens bound for New York City were only able to make one train stop before being rounded up by immigration police. Joe managed to squeeze out one phone call and informed his uncle, who was waiting for him in New York, and he would likely be thrown out of the country. Upset, he and Pete were already planning a new plan to cross the border when they were informed that some very generous gentlemen had posted a $1,000 bail for them each. This man was Stefano Magaddino of Buffalo, who happened to be the nephew of Stefano Magaddino of Castellammare, and a cousin of Bonanno himself. He was 14 years older than Joe and had been a resident of the States for over 2 decades. Magaddino learned of his relative's trouble just from talking to the uncle Bonanno had called, and sent his man, named Willie Moretti, to get them out. By the way, Moretti would later be high up in the American Mafia, and the story of how he first met Joe Bonanno on American soil, Willie will tell every chance he gets. Joe reached New York City by January 1925. There, he settled in the home of his uncle, Peter Bonventre, who worked as a barber, and he was happy to help his nephew learn the trade. However, to cut hair and break into the people in the head of young Bonanno did not quite come together in one whole. So Joe chose a different road. To be more precise, he's decided to start looking for this very other way up. And he was helped in this by the Bonanno surname, the true value of which he began to realize. In New York, there were many natives of Castellammare, within even the Sicilian immigrant community, trying to stay together. And they all knew very well who Salvatore Bonanno was. And even though Joe's father had long been dead, many wanted to show their respect for Bonanno and his son. In addition, Joe's cousin, Stefano Magaddino, was a mafia boss in Buffalo, which further emphasized his belonging to the so-called royal mafia bloodlines. So many young Italians wanted to be friends with him and get the support of the Bonanno surname. Because of that, Joe didn't even have to look for the way up. He found it himself in the person of a fellow from Sicily named Giovanni Romano and his friend Gaspar Di Gregorio, who were bootleggers. Romano and Di Gregorio found it profitable to have a man with that surname as a partner, and Bonanno was glad to be finally engaged in something that could bring in good money. It was certainly not an enterprise that produced thousands of liters per day, but the earnings were enough for the young people who did not deny themselves anything. They made alcohol in the basement of a house, and then, through an underground tunnel, transported it to the garage next door, where it was placed in trucks, which were already taking the goods to underground bars. The local police did not touch their enterprise, receiving constant payments, and for the big criminals, they were not interested in everything. So the young bootleggers had a clear feeling that they had caught a lucky trail. Now a couple more years like this, and it would be possible to invest their earnings in a legal business, which will provide them for the rest of their lives. However, nothing in this world is so easy. One day, Romano was brewing another batch of whiskey in the cellar as usual, and for some reason did not notice the leakage of alcohol, which caught fire and provoked an explosion. Giovanni didn't survive, and Joe took the event to heart and quit bootlegging, which was followed by the strangest period of Bonanno in the USA. Strange in the context of the man's history, which in the States is inextricably linked to illegal activities. Joe worked as a driver in another uncle's bakery and also attended acting classes, both of which were successful for him. At the bakery, he took on what would now be called a sales manager role and expanded his uncle's customer base. And in acting classes, the instructor considered Joe his best student. However, the fame of his family did not dispose to work as a driver or actor. Bonanno himself understood this, but has not yet seen to the end of his path. Guide, thanks to which Joe will finally stand on the road of a man of honor, will arrive at the end of 1925, and his name, Salvatore Maranzano, in his close communication with him that will make in 6 years from a young man who does not know what he wants, a man who will become the youngest boss of the Mafia. I want to ask you to take your mind off the video for a moment and look at this cool print I made for you. If you like it, you can buy any product you like by clicking the link in the description. And of course, every item you purchase contributes to the growth and advancement of the channel. Thank you for your attention, and now let's dive deeper into the story of our hero for today. The Maranzano family name in the history of American Mafia is primarily associated with the Castellammarese War. However, in this video, I will not touch on its entire chronology, as I've already done it several times in my videos and do not want to repeat myself again. Instead, if you don't know the history of the Castellammarese War, I suggest you pause this video, follow the link in the description, and watch the full history of this conflict, which I covered in the video about the birth of the American Mafia. Then come back here and continue watching with a full understanding of what it's all about. Joe Bonanno first met Maranzano in America at a dinner to celebrate his arrival in the States. Salvatore fled the fascists who repressed men of honor in Italy and settled in New York, among the other natives of the Castellamare. In Sicily, he fought against Buccellato, along with Salvatore Bonanno and Stefano Magaddino, so Joe knew him from early childhood. Maranzano then moved to Palermo, but even there, they saw each other from time to time. When Uncle Stefano came to visit Joe at the Naval Academy, they went to Salvatore's office together. In America, however, this acquaintance took on a different, more intimate form. Maranzano saw in Bonanno leadership qualities, abilities that allowed his father to manage the clan in Sicily, and Joe, in turn, saw in Salvatore the example of a leader, which he wanted to look up to. The puzzle came together, and the men began to spend more and more time together. At first, it was the usual social events like going to the movies or dinner, but very soon, everything turned into a business plan. Maranzano invited Joe to work for him, and Bonanno gladly agreed. Salvatore put his protege in charge of the bootlegging business, and apparently, the moral trauma of the previous incident with illegal alcohol was already forgotten, for Joe began to work with great enthusiasm. He was responsible for overseeing all the distilleries, including upstate and Pennsylvania, and solving any problems that arose. Ingredient supply disruptions, Joe was on his way to solve it. Competitors set fire to the shop, Joe goes to find and punish these people. Stolen cars with goods, Joe goes to find and return them. The hustle and bustle of Bonanno's work was notorious, but it paid off well, both financially and reputationally. He managed to earn enough money to open his own small distillery, and along with the growing reputation of Maranzano and the American Mafia family grew the reputation of Bonanno, even though he was not yet a member of the family. In this context, it is very indicative of the case where Joe wanted to attack a member of the Castellamare family, nicknamed Mimi, who wanted to cover his distillery. Bonanno sent him away and clearly hinted that if he came here again with his demand, Mimi would not leave alive. Joe did not know that the man was an initiate, and Mimi did not know who was behind Joe. As a result, an internal trial was organized for this case. And just imagine Mimi's feelings when he found out that the arbitrator in solving the dispute would be Bonanno's third cousin, Vito Bonventre. And so to speak, the lawyers were Buffalo Mafia boss Stefano Magaddino and rapidly gaining weight among the Castellamarians of New York, Salvatore Maranzano. It could be said that he was defended by the most prominent Castellamarans in the American Mafia. After this case, even those in the family who previously did not know the surname Bonanno realized that Joe occupies an extremely privileged position, and his further official admission to the family was more of a formality rather than carried a significant change in status. Bonanno in time became a kind of squire to Maranzano, one of his closest advisors and subordinates, so that when the power of Salvatore grew, then also grew the power of Bonanno. Joe's status as Maranzano's confidant was further established during the Castellamare War. When Salvatore was killed, Joe was one of the prime candidates to take over as boss. First, many had heard of his father and knew how respected the Bonanno family name was. Second, in Buffalo, he was backed by Magaddino, who had a lot of influence in the Castellammarese in the States. Well, third, many, like Maranzano during his lifetime, saw Bonanno as having leadership qualities. All of these combined factors and allowed Joe to become the youngest boss in the history of the American Mafia, but it was Maranzano's patronage that led him to be considered as boss at all. And it just so happened that the death of his teacher was the lever to the final rise. Maranzano could not leave the war, for which he paid. Joe, on the other hand, had more foresight as his boss. He did not retaliate against Luciano, but instead agreed to peace and was included in the first commission. And yes, the commission is not Luciano's invention, and he never headed it. I also talked about this in detail in my video about the birth of the American Mafia. The commission, as a body for solving disputes, And it is true that at first it was very effective. For more than 10 years, the Mafia was not shaken by wars or high-profile murders. The bosses quietly ran their families and got rich, and Bonanno was no exception. His plan to come to the States and move up was very close to being realized. He had more than a dozen companies with businesses ranging from cheese-making to the garment industry. He earned so much that by the late 1950s, he could afford to buy 3 luxury homes in different parts of the country. But the most important thing was not even that. Joe was not only able to rise, he managed to keep his borgata in the world and remain its boss, even during the times of extreme turbulence of the New York Mafia, which began in the late 1940s. The first call that dark times were brewing was a hidden conflict between boss Vincent Mangano and his subordinate Albert Anastasia, who had the good relations and support of another family's boss, Frank Costello. Eventually, Mangano disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and Anastasia became the boss, thus formed the first alliance in the commission. Opposing this alliance were the old-timers in the person of Bonanno, Profaci, and Magaddino. And after the disappearance of Mangano, who was the chairman of the commission, the role of the most authoritative boss and the chairman went to Bonanno. You could say that this was the peak of his power, and Joe tried his best to hold on to it. And although in his book he describes later events as an attempt to keep the general peace, in retrospect, there is a clear effort not to let go of the power that had fallen into his hands, which was beginning to be encroached upon by other bosses. After the alliance of Costello and Anastasia was formed, Vito Genovese, who wanted to oust Costello, and Tommy Lucchese, who just became boss, teamed up against them. A full-blown Cold War was beginning, threatening to turn into a hot war, and Costello even brought in the issue of Lucchese wanting to kill Anastasia before the commission. But Tommy was acquitted, thanks in large part to Bonanno. And Joe describes his act as an act in favor of universal justice and world peace. However, if reasoned logically, it was not to his advantage to convict and remove Lucchese, for then the Anastasia Costello faction would have turned against Bonanno himself and his growing influence. The only thing Joe did not foresee here was Lucchese's luck and ability. First, Tommy's ally Genovese outed Costello and became the boss. And then together, they backed Carlo Gambino, who became boss after Anastasia's murder. And by the early 1960s, it appeared that Bonanno's leading position in the commission was in great doubt. And here we come to the most interesting part, the story of how Joe tried to take over the commission. First, let's take a closer look at what the factions had formed by this point. On one side, there were Lucchese, Magaddino, Gambino, Thomas Eboli, and his new commissioner Angelo Bruno from Philadelphia. On the other, Bonanno and Profaci. Another new member, Joe Zarelli of Detroit, and Sam Giancana of Chicago, were leaning toward Bonanno at the time, but were not ardent supporters. So how is it, you ask, that in just a couple of years, Bonanno would squander all of his supporters on the commission? Well, with Lucchese, Gambino, and Eboli, who replaced Genovese, everything is clear. But with Magaddino, the story is interesting. When Bonanno was elected boss in the early 1930s, Magaddino quite logically thought that he could spin his younger brother in his own interests. However, by the 1950s, it became clear that among the two of them, the leading position was taken by Joe. And to this fact, they both wanted to extend their influence to Canada. And we have a rift, which the Lucchese faction took advantage of by luring Stefano to their side. So it turned out that from the old allies of Joe was left only Profaci, whose family was in full swing rebellion against the Gallo brothers. And in 1962, Profaci and an all will die. And the boss will be, albeit loyal to Bonanno, but less authoritative, Joe Malocco. What was Bonanno to do in such a situation? Accept it? Leave? Or maybe try to organize a coup? As Joe states in his autobiography, he chose the first option, and then began to prepare for the second option, except that all other sources say the opposite. Who's to believe in this case? I suggest you choose for yourself, and I will only present both versions of the same events that happened next, leading, nevertheless, to the same outcome. The generally accepted version is that Joe decided to regain control of the commission by killing Lucchese, Gambino, and Magaddino. It derives primarily from the authorities' data, and especially from the wiretaps of the family's New Jersey's boss, Sam DeCavalcante. When Profaci died and Malocco took over the family, Joe offered to get rid of him, leaving him alone to deal with the rebellion of the Gallo brothers, the leaders of the commission. Malocco subscribed to this idea and involved in his plans a man named Joe Colombo, who betrayed him and told of the conspiracy of the commission. At a hearing on the case, the commission kept Malacco alive, but he still died of natural causes a year later. Bonanno, he did not give out at those hearings, but everyone understood everything. Joe himself could not be summoned. He avoided the event by all means. But in the version of Bonanno himself, he was not involved in any conspiracy and associated with him only because of the fact that his son, Bill, kindly drove Malacco to a meeting, which by coincidence was with a man who was following someone from the trio of Lucchesi, Gambino, Magaddino. About this, of course, learned Colombo had told Magaddino, but Stefano, out of jealousy, interpreted it as a conspiracy in which involved and Bonanno Sr. Well, and then everything is exactly the same. Malacco confesses, but no one believes that he acted alone. Joe then lives in Arizona for a while and then goes, in his version, to travel and contact for legitimate business in Canada, and in the version pushed to everyone by Magaddino to encroach on his territory. In the end, Bonanno succeeds at neither, and he is locked up in Canadian jail on charges of perjury while applying for an immigration card. As a result of the proceedings, he has to leave the country and return to New York, where something awaited him that he had never faced before in his entire career as a boss. Whether he set up that plot with Malacco himself, or whether he was dragged into it against his will, you decide for yourself. But it resulted in Joe not just losing his final influence in the commission, but getting in trouble within his own family. Until his return from Canada in 1964, the family was run by Joni Morales, who informed Bonanno that Joan Tartamella, the former consigliere at the time, could no longer hold his position due to health reasons. Joe gave the go-ahead to hold a vote among the captains on the selection of a new consigliere, who was chosen to be Bill Bonanno. Whether it was Joe's patronage or the majority really electing Bill, it is hard to say now, but it is impossible to argue with the fact that there was a group dissatisfied with this decision, and this faction was led by Gaspar Di Gregorio, former son-in-law of Magaddino, who naturally supported him in this. Stefano convinced the commission that Joseph Bonanno was not worthy to lead his family. He cited his possible involvement in the Magliocco conspiracy and the fact that he had lobbied his son for a leadership position when many in the family were unhappy. As a result, the commission supported Di Gregorio's rebellion and outlawed Bonanno's son and father. Naturally, Joe, who received such news shortly after his return, disagreed. He did not recognize Di Gregorio as the new boss and refused to abide by the commission's decision, gathering most of the family around him, as he states in his book. Bonanno Sr. was going to fight, but coincidentally, his son had to lead the fight, which history will call the Bonanno War. On October 20th, 1964, Joe was kidnapped by unknown people, and for a long time no one knew where he was. Even now, researchers have not come to a consensus on what happened then. Some believe that Bonanno faked his kidnapping to avoid possible attempts, and someone believes in the version of Joe himself, claiming that he was kidnapped and taken to a house in the middle of the forest by Magaddino's men. And if the details of the first version we do not have, but the second is perfectly described in the book Man of Honor. Bonanno spent several months in his cabin, during which he was constantly visited by Stefano. In Joe's opinion, with this kidnapping, Magaddino wanted to intimidate him and make him give up the fight for his family. Whether he considered the option of murder is not known, but in the end, Stefano let Joe go, even though he couldn't convince him to retire. Magaddino gave his men the command to take the prisoner wherever he requested. Bonanno asked to go to El Paso, on the Mexican border, so that Stefano would think he was running there. Joe himself went from there to Tucson, in the state of Arizona, where he had a house. There, he was met by a friend who would then drive him groceries and keep him in touch with Bill in New York. Here, Bonanno would lead a guerrilla life for several months. None of the neighbors never guessed that anyone was in the house during that period. A friend who brought groceries and before that often checked the house in the absence of the owners, because of which suspicion was not aroused. And Joe himself did not appear near the windows during daylight hours, ate at night by the light of a flashlight, and did everything he could to avoid detection. Such a life inevitably led to changes in his appearance. No, Joe did not turn into a likeness of Gollum from Lord of the Rings, but the growth of hair on his face and head greatly changed his appearance. And adding to this a cane, an inexpensive coat, a sheep's wool cap, and an eye patch, Bonanno decided that he could return to New York in this image and not be afraid that his enemies could identify him. And so indeed he did. When Joe secretly returned, he set up a meeting with Johnny Morales, the leader of the group that had backed Bonanno. Morales didn't recognize his boss until he spoke to him. Joe told him at the meeting that he had no plans to announce his return yet and would live covertly for a while to assess the situation from the outside. The reason for coming out of hiding was the assassination attempt on his son. Di Gregorio set up a meeting with Morales to supposedly negotiate terms of peace between the two factions. After all the time Joe had been on the run, the two camps had been at war and occasionally shot at each other. Morales couldn't go, and Bill Bonanno went instead, and what awaited him there was not a negotiation, but machine gun fire on the approach to the house. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but Joe decided that the situation was getting too hot, and there was no point in hiding any longer. Back to business, Bonanno's first order of business was to talk to the commission, letting them know that he didn't want a war with anyone outside the family and would handle his own affairs. The bosses heard his offer, but continued to support the opposing group, where, instead of the ailing Di Gregorio, Paul Sciacca became the leader. However, the storm had already raged so badly that even an old, experienced captain like Joe Bonanno could not bring his ship to the dock. For over a year, he tried to unite the men under his command, but the rebel group, as well as the commission, no longer recognized him as the boss. And finally, in 1968, after the third heart attack of his life, Bonanno decided to retire from the business. His son Bill similarly left the family, the strife in which would continue long after their departure. But Joe had a second front. The authorities were anxious to put him in jail, and they didn't care whether he resigned or not. Bonanno was a mob boss, and the hunt for such people in the second half of the 20th century in the States was comparable to witch hunts in the Middle Ages. His first encounter with the police was during the Castellammarese War, when he was caught in a car with a gun, but the cops could not prove that it belonged to Joe, so the charges were dropped. By the way, after that incident, Bonanno was first in the papers. He was called Al Capone's man because of the fact that the Thompson submachine guns found in his car were most often used by the Chicago gangster. But Joe's real trouble with the law began after a meeting in Appalachian, where the mob bosses from all over the country gathered. This meeting was covered by the police and was publicized in the media, becoming a shock to the public and bringing the problem of the Mafia to the forefront. In general, Bonanno was against this convention. When he was preparing, Joe was in Italy and learned about it after returning to the States, and it wasn't good for Bonanno. Genovese and Lucchese took advantage of his departure and staged a coup. Vito became the boss of his family, forcing Costello out. And in another family, the boss, Albert Anastasia, was murdered, and his successor was Lucchese loyalist Carlo Gambino. And this national convention was to help them legitimize all these changes, which would reduce Bonanno's wagging, as we discussed with you above. Joe tried his best to avoid an official invitation, and when he did get one, he sent his men there instead. He didn't want to be there to see his influence dwindle in a matter of hours. However, he was still in the papers. Joe had asked his men to renew his driver's license before he left, and after he arrived, Di Gregorio, who was supposed to give it to him, kept forgetting to do so, and by coincidence, he went with them and to a meeting in Appalachian where Bonanno had sent him. So first the authorities who discovered Gasper had these driver's licenses, and then the media decided Joe was there. Actually, from that point on, the state went into full-scale prosecution of Bonanno. After Appalachian, he, as well as the others, were charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice for the fact that no one at the meeting stated the real reason for the meeting. In the end, of course, no one was charged, and Joe never even went to trial, as he was recovering from a second heart attack in 1958. The first one was in 1951, but Bonanno obviously did not draw any conclusions from it, as well as from the second one, as you can judge from what I told you earlier. The next time the authorities tried to invent a charge against Joe was after his return from Canada in 1964. Why invent? Because they couldn't find anything to really prove his criminal record. So they used Bonanno's troubles in Canada as an excuse to question him in front of a grand jury. They hoped that with his answers, they would give at least the slightest clue as to where they needed to dig. For 3 days, the authorities questioned Joe about everything they could think of, and each time they got a reference to the Fifth Amendment. Bonanno was released once again. However, in October of that year, Joe was again summoned to answer questions in front of a grand jury. And exactly one day before the hearing, he was kidnapped. And not showing up to court when you're subpoenaed is not a good idea. And it's an even worse idea to say a couple of months afterward that you're going to show up for court on a certain date and then not show up again. When Joe told Bill through an acquaintance that he was alive and safe, he took it to mean that his father would be back soon, and he excitedly told his lawyer. And the lawyer, out of the best motives before his client, himself asked to set a date for the meeting. But as we already know, Bonanno was not going to come out of hiding. In fact, the grand jury never waited for anyone. When Joe was back in the public eye, so to speak, he did not even receive a contempt citation. He was yanked into court on the case for more than a year, but the authorities had nothing on him. Did that mean they would decide to leave him alone sooner or later? Absolutely not. And following Bonanno's move to Arizona, so did his showdown with the authorities, which here took a very unexpected turn. It all started one day in July 1968. Joe and his wife and Bill had dinner, and his son decided to go out for a smoke. And then Bonanno Sr. heard a shotgun blast and then an explosion. Someone unknown tried to throw a bomb into the house, but Bill's shot prevented him from taking good aim, and the explosion went off without reaching the target. Who exactly it was, Joe couldn't say at the time, but he was sure that the media speculation of a gangster war had no basis in fact. Similar incidents happened to several other mobsters living in Tucson, but Bonanno was adamant that he had never asked anyone to throw bombs at them, nor did he believe they had done such a thing. The answer came a year later when police apprehended 2 men who confessed to the bombings. As it turned out, FBI agent David Hale was behind the whole thing and had set these men and a few others up to, as he told them, cleanse the city of the mob. The plan was for them to set off explosions in the homes of several gangsters living in Tucson, which would lead to conflict and their self-destruction. As a result, the bombers were jailed and Hale was just fired. And what do you think? Maybe now that their agent tried to either kill or frame Joe Bonanno for a crime spree, the authorities have gotten off his back? Oh no, they're just getting the hang of it. The FBI recruited a friend of his son Joseph's named David Hill, who managed to sneak into Bonanno's home in Tucson and lived there with them for an extended period of time. And here again, he passed by. Studtick was only able to talk to the old fox into speculation about art and philosophy. He got no more information. The investigation, which finally managed to put Bonanno behind bars, began only in 1975 and lasted for 5 years. And do you know already how much the subject of this elusive Italian was itching the agency? As part of this investigation, there was a separate team of agents who were investigating Bonanno's trash every day during that time. That is, they would arrive early in the morning before the garbage truck. They would take the trash out of the bins and they would throw it in there, brought it with them so the garbage men wouldn't have any questions as to why the bins were empty every day. Then they'd take the trash apart and try to find anything that hinted at illegal activity. And you know what the fun part is? Joe was already writing his daily to-do list on a piece of paper, often in Sicilian dialect, which is different language than standard Italian, which often led to agents going off the wrong trail. For example, as it became known later, they found this note: "Call Titone and pay for the sanatore." Sanatore from Italian means to cut or kill, which made the agents think that Joe was reminding himself to call a man named Titone and pay him to kill. In fact, Bonanno really did have to call such a man, except he had to pay him for a cutting board, which is what the word sanatore still means in the Sicilian dialect. Or another time, they found a note that said, "Void, Bob Green." Agents interpreted this as a potential threat to journalist Bob Green, who had recently published a story about mobster Peter Licavoli. In fact, Joe reminded himself to write down his thoughts, that the memo was empty, not interesting or credible. Unbeknownst to him, the authorities had Green under 24-hour guard. In addition, during the investigation, a tracker was discreetly attached to Bonanno's car to track his movements. His cell phones were tapped. He was infiltrated by an undercover man named Lou Peters, who befriended his son, Bill, and through that friendship tried to reach Joe himself. And finally, the authorities were trying to connect him to his son's murky dealings in California. You know what the outcome of this 5-year witch hunt was? 5 years in prison for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Joe only served 1 year of that. Then, there's another 14 months because of a book called Man of Honor, in which Bonanno detailed the entire history of the American Mafia that he was able to catch. Joe would refuse to testify in the racketeering case that Giuliani was prosecuting. The prosecutor wanted to talk to him about the Mafia setup, and when Bonanno refused, he got jail time for obstruction of justice. It was only after that the authorities got off Joe's back, although, to tell the truth, the punishments were so far for a longtime leader of a criminal organization. After serving his time, Bonanno returned to his home in Arizona and lived quietly there among his children and grandchildren. He outlived virtually all of his friends and enemies, and despite numerous heart attacks, he managed to live to the age of 97, passing away only in 2002. This was the biography of Joseph Bonanno, a mobster who was one of the first to venture out on his own to tell his story. A story of an early rise, a painful fall, and a fortunate old age.